What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time? Cassie, it's great to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a treat to be here.
So I want to start with a big question to start high level, and then we'll drill down a bit.
Yeah.
What have you found to be the commonalities among the world's happiest people?
That is a really good question. It's not just my examination of the commonalities, but I can definitely speak to what the research has uncovered. And the answer is pretty straightforward, surprisingly or not, that it is about having strong supportive relationships, having a genuine sense of connection and belonging, which involves feeling known and sort of genuinely knowing another person. And so this is shows up in the data in lots and lots of ways. And even it shows up in, everyone is familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which, at the very basic, well, at the bottom of the pyramid of the things that we need in order to survive and thrive are these physiological needs like safety, health, food, water. But just beyond that, once you have your physical health and safety and food and water, it is the most basic psychological need is social connection and belonging. And then, sort of as you progress up the pyramid towards self-actualization, which we are ideally striving towards, then you get sort of closer to more individual pursuits. But my answer for you of happy people are those that have good relationships, that have good friendships.
Who's the happiest person you know?
Me?
Yourself?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean,
That's pretty
and it
awesome
is.
if true. I mean, really, you got to say more about that.
Well, it is what I study.
I know.
And it is not only what sort of is underlying what I study, but is driven by my wanting to understand what are the characteristics and the decisions actually that drive my experience in the day to day and satisfaction with life overall, such that all of us can make decisions that contribute to that. I mean, when you look at what are the inputs into people's happiness, there is a lot that's outside of our control. Our inherited disposition, sort of, were you born a naturally glass half full type person, or more of a or natural grump where you see the annoyances of one situation? That has actually a really big effect. Life circumstances that we don't have a lot of control over have some effect, but a surprisingly small one. And I teach this a course among our MBAs and executive MBAs at UCLA. And I start the course by pointing out that these life circumstances, like level of wealth, how attractive you are, marital status, these things that people think, having a big house, if only I had this, then I would be happy. And what the research actually speaks to is that those life circumstances do have some effect, but a surprisingly smaller impact than we think. And so those are things that we don't have a lot of control over. The thing we do have control over is what we do, how we spend our time, and how we approach that time, sort of what we are thinking and doing in the day to day. And that has a significant and significantly larger impact on our happiness. And when I say happiness, it's how we feel in the day to day, as well as how we feel about our lives overall. So there's this emotional component, as well as this evaluative component. So this is sort of what I've set out to do. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to have a more cheery disposition, but of course, we're all subjected to some circumstances in life that make it a little more trying. And so it is relying on these tools that the research identifies. How should we be thinking? What should we be doing? How should we be spending our time? And executing on that.
What are what
That's a
what are,
lie. I know you're like, where do I
no,
go
I
from
love
here?
it. I mean, I'm taking notes. What are some things? So I think we could learn some actionable takeaways by diving. When you surprised me a bit by saying that, but I'm glad that you did. So I'm going to dig in more when it comes to what you actually do, so that I could learn from you, others could learn from you, to say, okay, what can I do to make each day better, to make it happier, to make better use of my time. So the natural follow up would be, well, what do you actually do to be the happiest person that you know?
Now that I'm like, it's framed as that. How about I am very happy? I don't want to
Hey,
make it
that's
to be
great.
a
I'll take it.
relative
Okay, I'll take it.
relative thing. And I um well, there's a lot. I mean, it's sort of unpacking how to, so I guess one of the barriers that I have experienced to my sort of chosen happiness, so to speak, that so many people experience as a barrier, is this feeling of not having enough time, of time being that primary limitation. And there, this sort of acute feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it is what we in the research term as time poverty. And it is prevalent. It is, I conducted a national poll that showed that almost half of Americans feel time poor. It is experienced, um, women tend to experience it more than men. Working parents are particularly time poor, but all types of people feel a lacking sense of time. And it is a barrier because it limits us from really wonderful things in our life. So our research shows that when people feel time poor, they are less healthy. So they are less likely to exercise, which, as we can talk about, is a mood booster and a contributor to happiness. People are likely to delay going to the doctor. So people are they're more likely to eat fast food, which is less healthy. So people are less healthy. They're less nice. So when we feel time poor and like we're in a hurry, we become particularly stingy with our time, not spending the time to help others. And we can also talk about one way to increase your happiness is by actually doing acts of kindness. When we feel time poor, we feel less confident, like we're able to accomplish the goals that we set out to do. And our research shows that when people feel time poor, they are less happy. They feel more stress and worry in the day-to-day. They feel less positive emotion like enjoyment. In the day-to-day, they feel less of a sense of meaning, less sense of satisfaction. Um, and I can absolutely say that that time poverty or feeling time poor, that I don't have enough time, has been and is continues to be a barrier that I am working against. And I mean, it's so impactful that I remember, and I share this as sort of the genesis in the opening chapter of my book, Happier Hour, which is all about investing our time for greater happiness and fulfillment. Thinking back to earlier in my career, when I was a professor at Wharton, living in Philly at the time, and there was this night that I really sort of reached my limit and I was like, I don't think I can do it all. So I had given a talk that morning up in New York at Columbia's Business School about my research. I had a 4-month-old at home. So like in order to go give this talk, I had like missed out on morning snuggles, back-to-back meetings around the presentation, a colleague dinner that night, and I am like rushing to get the very last train that would get me home back to Philly to my baby and my husband. And I remember as I was like, the sole person on this train car because it is so late and the darkness sort of wishing by of everyone asleep in their houses and the trees. And I'm like, life is going so fast. And between the pressures of work, between the pressures of wanting to be a good parent, wanting to be a good partner, wanting to be a good friend, trying to keep my house from getting gross. We all have like sort of chores in our life. It's like it's too much to do and not enough time to do it. And I was like, I don't actually think I can keep up. I think the solution is to quit my job, move to a, island where I can relax all day and have a whole lot more time. Wouldn't I there be happier? Um, and we actually, it was like, because I'm a researcher, I put this question to the test and actually with some of my colleagues, Hal Hirschfield and Marissa Sharif, we look to identify what is the relationship between the amount of discretionary time we have and our happiness to answer this question, my sort of personal question, my research question. If I had a whole lot more time, would I be happier? And what the results showed us, we analyzed data from tens of thousands of working and non-working Americans. And what we found was, yes, having too little discretionary time is bad. People are unhappy. That was me. But what was surprising is that we found that among people who had a whole lot of discretionary time, as in this data set, at least more than 5 hours of discretionary time in a regular day to do what they wanted, you actually saw that they were less happy. And in digging into that, it's really that people sort of are averse to being idle. We want some time to be able to spend on the things that we care about and that interest us and maybe even to relax. But if you have a whole lot of time spent relaxing, then people feel a lacking sense of productivity and purpose, and that leads to less satisfaction. So to answer, sort of touching back to this question, what do I do for happiness? Well, I did not actually quit my job. And instead, I've been really deliberate in spending more of my time on ways that feel worthwhile and fulfilling, and minimizing the amount of time that I spend on activities that feel more wasteful. And so, and we can sort of dig into that. But I think that that is what has sort of shifted me from this like stressed, time poor, less happy state to the sort of the day-to-day that I am living right now, which I feel very happy and very fulfilled, and yes, very busy. But days I feel fulfilling and not just full.
What advice do you have? Thank you, Cassie. I appreciate. I mean, I think that's super helpful, as well as all of the research in the background. So when I work with leaders, one of the common things I hear is like we actually pull out their calendars and look at them every day and look at them for the week, look at them for the month, and there's a lot of them, especially if they're like a VP level or kind of that level where they're both managing all of their people and they're managing up. So they go both ways, and obviously they have peers to collaborate with. Let's say it's a VP in a Fortune 500 company, and you pull their calendar out and it's back to back to back to back to back to back. And a lot of those meetings though, they're fulfilled, they're happy, they're helping their people, they're helping them, advance in their careers and achieve goals and earn a living to create economic security for their families. Like that, it's rewarding work, but it's nonstop. And it at times I look at it and say, I don't know how you do it. What advice do you have for that person where they are back to back to back to back all day? Some of it though is good and some of it they're exhausted from. What advice for that person?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot to unpack there because it is the back to back to back to back without these breaks to sort of sustain and sort of fill one's own energy. The back to back to back to back is unsustainable, and so not only for sort of your own sake of making sure that you do carve out some time to take care of yourself so that you feel better, but also for the folks that you're working with and those who are on your team under you as those that you're sort of supporting within your organization above you, they need you to be full and energized as well. So when, like with happiness as this objective, it's important. It's not just this sort of frivolous idea of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to feel good and to feel good about my life. Um, it is important, and research shows that when people feel happier, they are more helpful to those around them. They are better colleagues, more willing to sort of support their colleagues as well as the organization. When people are happy, they're more creative and adaptive in their problem solving. And so you see that actually happy employees are rated as better employees by their managers. Happy managers are rated as better leaders by their employees. In our interpersonal relationships too, you see that when people feel happy, they like others more, they are liked by others more. And there are these health ramifications that you react better to physiological stressors. So it's like taking care of your emotional well-being is not a sort of selfish, frivolous pursuit. It is absolutely helps those around you, again, those on your team and those above you. Now, so period, it's important. How do you do that? And it does require taking stock of the time that you're spending. So when weeks are full of back-to-back meetings, you do need to take stock of which of those ways of spending time are indeed worthwhile, which are actually not particularly crucial to your sort of longer term goals. And one way to do that is actually doing a time crafting exercise or time tracking exercise. And this is one that I have my students do and I encourage everyone to do. And it is about taking stock to identify what are the worthwhile and what are the wasteful ways of spending. And what it is over the course of a week, I actually suggest doing 2 weeks because it's a more sort of complete gauge or reflection of the typical activities that fill your weeks. But as you're spending for each 30-minute increment, you write down what you're doing, and not only what you're doing. So it wouldn't just be work meeting because that wouldn't be informative because the whole day is work meetings. But what is the particular meeting? Whom is it with? And in addition to writing down what you're doing, also rating on a 10-point scale how happy, but that includes satisfying, worthwhile, fulfilling, meaningful, useful, did you feel from that time? And what you have with this sort of data set at the end, even though the sort of process of tracking can feel quite tedious, the amount of information and valuable information that you gain looking back is really informative, because from it you can identify, all right, what are those activities that were the most happy, the most worthwhile within the week, as well as what are those that are the worst. And of those that are worthwhile, it's not just the activities themselves, but what were some of the commonalities or the commonalities across those sort of happiest activities? And so that you can pick out, oh, it's, this type, it is engaging on this particular project or in this particular way, um, such that you can, in crafting your time going forward, is making sure that you do carve out and prioritize and make the time for that. But just as helpful is actually looking at the least happy ways of spending. The dimensions, when I've had my students do this, that sort of pop out as the most least happy ways of spending, seem to be those that thwart our, sort of drives, our fundamental drives of relatedness. So anything that makes you feel lonely or disconnected is actually, pops up often as, being, the least happy. Those that undermine our agency, so our sense of control, those are things that really feel obligatory and not at all that you had any say in that time. Those are things that pop up, as well as those that make us feel less competent. So competence is another drive. So that make us feel sort of productive. And that's where you sort of pick up on these ways that feel like they really do feel like a waste, that you spent your time and there was nothing worthwhile in it. And that's really painful. But we are actually so averse, we're more averse to wasting time than we are to money, and research shows that. In addition to the helpfulness of identifying the sort of dimensions or types of activities that are worthwhile versus wasteful, you can also see just how much time you're spending on these activities. And and many actually identify like, oh my gosh, there are actually big chunk of hours in the week, even for those that are back to back, super busy. There are chunks of hours that are wasteful, that they weren't necessary uses of time and they weren't even enjoyable. And those are the pieces of, like, those are the activities that you should minimize and remove from your schedule if possible. If they are necessary but unhappy, then there are other ways that you can, or strategies that you can use to make those times feel less wasteful. So bundling strategies. So bundling is a strategy sort of identified by researchers Katie Milkman and her colleagues. And it's basically you take something that isn't fun that you have to do, like, I mean, I'll go outside of the work realm, folding laundry. Um, but you have to do it, and you can think about what within the workday are the folding laundry equivalents. It's like it has to be done. It's not fun to do it. Is there another activity that actually does feel worthwhile that you can do at the same time to not only sort of motivate you to do that activity, but to make that activity more enjoyable? So while folding laundry, listening to the Learning Leader podcast so that you are enriched, or listening to an audiobook. When we don't feel like we have a lot of time, when we feel time poor, one of the activities that gets removed from our schedule is reading for pleasure. Many people, when I ask them to complete the sentence, I don't have time to, and you can actually complete that sentence in your head. I'm sure the list is long. One of the things that comes up often is I don't have time to read for pleasure. And that's a bummer, right? Reading for pleasure. That's what expands our minds, makes us more empathetic. And if you just listen to an audiobook while you were folding laundry or commuting to work, the average American commutes 30 minutes each way. So that's an hour, and that's just the average. We get those that commute way longer. Commuting tends, in the time tracking research, tends to be the least happy activity, and it's because it feels like a waste. But to the extent that you bundle it with something that is enriching, joyful, fun, interesting, then that commute time, that laundry folding time, no longer feels like a waste.
Completely agree. I wash the dishes, and that is great podcast listening time. I don't love it, but I actually kind of look forward to it because I know I'm like I got a good podcast queued up. I'm gonna really wash these dishes well because I'm thinking and learning and experiencing good storytelling typically. So you mentioned the exercises, and one of the exercises is time tracking. There are other ones throughout your book. And one that I particularly like because I've been doing it for a while that I'd love for you to expand on is called the Learning from Admired Elders exercise, where essentially you would identify an elder whose life you admire and interview them. Can you share more about the research behind this and why people should implement this activity right away?
Yeah, and I love that exercise. Um, so as we are making decisions about in the day to day about how to live a good life, um, there are those that have done it. Like,
Yeah.
we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so this is an opportunity to identify someone from your perspective has done it, has lived a good life, and ask them about it. And um, so that their experience can inform our choices right away. And so in identify someone whom you admire, who is sort of further along in life, and ask them the questions that I find so insightful. I is to ask, what is your greatest source of pride, as well as what is your greatest source of regret? And as I've, again, these are exercises that I assign to my students. And it's interesting because over the years of conducting this exercise, I have my students reflect back on what they heard from these admired elders. And these admired elders run the gamut. I mean, many of them are very supremely professionally accomplished, from different places around the world. Uh, and they're time and time again, as in every section of the class that I've been teaching for years, I ask them, and it is very stark. So 75% of people, their greatest source of pride are their relationships, are their family and the relationships they have. Interestingly, and again, these are very accomplished people. Interestingly, greatest source of regret was not spending enough time on relationships.
Mm.
So this is going back to, your very first question, like, what's the thing that makes people happiest? This is what's the thing that is so critical for living a good life? It is investing in the people. And this is not just from this exercise. There's a really fascinating study, the Harvard study of adult development, which followed a cohort of men, from in the Boston area. Some were Harvard students, some were from a more blue collar part of town. And for 75 years, they followed this cohort of men and would touch in with them every few years and ask what they were doing and how they were doing it. And we can look at, or they have looked at the data and there was a lot of variation, in how successful um, these folks not only started, but actually sort of, how it moved throughout their life. And the single biggest predictor of satisfaction at the end of life was, again, it was not fame, it was not wealth, it was having strong supportive relationships. So this is helpful for us because it influences how we spend our hours, how we devote our time. And it is the people within our life and the work space, but it is also the people in our life. So, like in relationships, it's like who you're mentoring, and having colleagues who you have as an authentic friend. There's this funny question in the Gallup poll that it sounds like something a third grader would ask, but it is very predictive. It is, do you have a best friend at work?
Hmm.
People who say yes to that question, you see that it is predictive of greater engagement at work, better performance at work, um, greater job satisfaction, which is job satisfaction is a significant predictor of overall life satisfaction. And so, yes, those like having at least a bestie at work, like an authentic friendship at work is really important. But it's also those relationships outside of work. And, you asked me, what is it that like I have really benefited from in my happiness? Or you asked like, why am I happy? It is because I have, in terms of like those worthwhile and like ways that I'm investing my time, it is through the work that I do that I love so much, of developing knowledge that, informs happiness, disseminating knowledge about what informs happiness. But it's also my relationships with my kids, that I invest in them. It can't be a lot of time because I'm not, with my job, I am not available to pick them up, at 3 o'clock every day. It is, but when I am spending my time with my kids, I am fully there. When I am carving out and creating that time to spend with my husband, just the two of us, I am fully there. Um, and it is making the time, the importance of prioritizing that time, such that I can feel full and energized and fulfilled, and then come into my work context, and be emotionally available and excited and energized and happy, and there can support them.
I love this exercise. I do it semi frequently on this podcast, and the one I think of the most is probably episode 457 with Ken Blanchard. Ken's kind of done what I want to do from a leadership perspective of writing books and teaching and sharing and helping other people. But when I asked him about kind of the best moments of his life, he said, you know what, recently for Margie, my wife's 80th birthday party, she's 80, so they've been around longer than us. And he said, we went to Hawaii, which is where she loves the most. We rented a giant house and filled it with all of the people we love. That was a magical moment. And I would encourage you to create magical moments in your life. That's what it's all about. And I thought, whoa, what am I doing to create magical moments, whatever it is, for the people I love the most, and to use our time, treasures, and talents to create more of those moments. Like, that's the whole point, right? So like, what are
Totally.
we doing
Yeah.
if we're going to grind away and work so hard, though? Like, how are we being intentional about creating those moments? And I think that exercise that you write about in your book is so useful for something like that.
Yeah. And I will point out that those magical moments are so important, and they don't have to be giant. Those
Right.
magical moments are actually, you'll see very often right there in our daily lives. It's just sometimes we miss them because we're not paying attention, because we're distracted. An example, and like, so I talked about the time tracking exercise as a way to identify worthwhile ways to spend. But another thing that you can do, and I would encourage you to do, and as an exercise in the book, is just reflecting back over your last 2 weeks. What were those moments where you felt the most joy? And no matter how busy we are, there are those joyful moments. Now, for me, my joyful moment, or one of them, is my weekly coffee date with my daughter. She is 7. And this is time that it is a half hour, and it is like it's an everyday not, it's not every day, it's every week, but it's a very routine functional activity. If on the face of it, it is dropping off my son, and before dropping off my daughter, before going into the office, I need a cup of coffee, so we stop at a coffee shop, and it is my caffeine fix, right? But actually what it is, it's this 30 minutes, and we've turned what was is a routine which is mindless, into a ritual, which is special and carries meaning. And that 30 minutes every week, it is so special. So my daughter and I, we like turn on the same songs because it's a ritual as, we're driving to the coffee shop. At the coffee shop, my phone is nowhere in sight. My to-do list that, runs through my head constantly is quieted. I am there with her. She gets her hot chocolate. I get my coffee, and we are just in it together. And we get to it, like that 30 minutes, it's only 30 minutes, but it has such a profound impact on how I feel over the course of the rest of the week. So it's like we look forward to it. So there's that anticipation. Of course, when we're in it, we're, delighting in it, but also I can reflect back on it. So it's like that 30 minutes influences my mood, not only for the rest of my day, but like my satisfaction when I think, how happy am I in life? I'm like, going back to your initial question, I am really happy. I have these people that I love so much, and I feel absolutely connected, even though I am working a lot and I'm not available at all times. When I am there with them, I'm totally in it. And so that it was, like amazing to have, like, an 85th or 80th birthday with like a house full of people. But we also have these people that are already sometimes in our house.
Yeah.
and and these friendships that are available, to us and our, family. And to the extent that we notice those little moments, those ordinary moments of joy, that can have a really big impact. And so no matter how busy, you are in the back-to-backs meetings, that you feel that you are fulfilled, that
I
you don't have
yeah.
this sense of regret. And actually, speaking of regret, your question about the interview exercise, I just got an email actually yesterday, which filled my heart. One of my former students let me know that from that exercise, he actually interviewed his grandfather, and his grandfather has since passed since he did the exercise. And it was, so at his funeral, he actually shared some of the learnings from the interview that he conducted. And he feels so grateful for not having sort of missed out on asking those questions for someone whom he admired so much. And it also allows that person's sort of legacy to live on. So all to say, the thing that, we absolutely do want to avoid is regret at the end of the day, not, at the end of the week where, did you not take that one extra meeting, but at the end of the weeks and years, are we living the life that we want to be living?
Wow, I love that. Every 100th episode of this podcast, I have my dad and my brother on, and it's funny, we ask each other questions during that podcast that we probably never would if we weren't like recording and having microphones in front of us. And I'm grateful that I have these kind of checkpoints over the years, and we'll continue to do it every 100th episode just to kind of like see what's going on. And since the first one, like my dad's retired and his life's completely changed, just to hear how it was at the beginning of those first recordings now to where we're at, I look forward to them, even though they're every 100 episode. And the other part you mentioned, and I'm so glad you brought this up, is a good reminder. Like I brought this up a couple episodes ago, but it's worth it saying again, especially when you talk about your Thursday coffee dates, because the reflection part's critical, I think. At the end of last summer, I did that kind of reflection as school was starting, and I noticed, and I asked, like, what was the best part about the summer? And the best part for me about the summer was throwing my 6-year-old daughter Charlie in the air at the pool, where she likes to, like, just launch out of the pool and kind of come down, biggest smile in the world on her face, and just again. We go for hours, and I love it. So I thought about, like, how do I make sure that, by the way, this doesn't cost any money. There's no renting of a house. There's nothing. She lives with me, right? How do I make sure I do more of that next summer, which is this past summer that we're kind of finishing up right now. And to do that, I had to plan well ahead of projects or books or different things I'm working on, podcasts to record, so that during the hot months, I live in Ohio, during the hot months when the pools open, I need to have more free time than in the cold months. So it was worth it for me to stack extra work when it was cold to have less when it was hot so that we could go to the pool earlier and just launch her. And so I've done that so many more times this summer than last because I did the reflection exercise to say, what was it? And I realize as well, she's now 7 turning 8 soon. Those days won't last forever. Just like your daughter won't be small forever, and the coffee dates, you could still do them, but they may change. So I think that's what's really important and why reflection is so important, because we're all in such a hurry that we forget to kind of stop and reflect on the moments that actually do make us happiest.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And the reflection is key. Also, another exercise is this related to what you were just saying, is this counting times left exercise.
Mm.
So I actually, and I did this using my coffee date with my daughter example. I calculate, so the first step is calculating how many times have you done it in the past, and like sort of before she started school, and as I was home on maternity leave, it was sort of my daily. So I'd bundle her up, I'd walk to the coffee shop, and that was our little time. And so I calculated, and she is 7, that I have done, we've had 404 coffee dates together in the past, but I also calculated, even more importantly, how many we have left. And while we are going, for our coffee dates weekly now, when she turns 12, she'd rather go to the coffee shop with her friends than with me. Then she's going to go off to college, and then she's going to, she's anything like I was, like, move to New York, so be on the other side of the country. And so in calculating that, and then how long I have to live, I calculated that I have 280 approximately coffee dates with my daughter left. So even though she is only 7, I have 30% of our coffee dates left together.
Mm.
And what that makes me do is, the intention is not to make you cry. It is, or me cry. The intention is to realize just how precious and how those times, while they seem everyday and mundane and accessible, they won't be there forever. And in recognizing just how precious they are, what it does is it motivates us to make the time, to carve out, to spend the time. And in addition, while spending that time, being fully attentive, again, putting the phones away, turning the ringer off so that whomever else can't reach you, that you are getting the most of that time that you are spending. And as you said, like, your preparation for your pool days with your daughter, yes, it does require preparation. So like on Wednesday night, I know that I might be staying up a little later to get a little bit more work done, so that my Thursday morning, if it does, I don't start meetings until 9 because I'm on this coffee date, that's fine. I've made, like, it's important enough to make the time and to work everything else around it, because those times are so precious. They're not going to be there forever. And I don't want to regret not having that time together.
I love the turn the routine into ritual. I think that's a quick takeaway for people to like think about that, do the reflection. One of the other exercises that I feel like we're very aligned on is the get moving exercise. I don't know about you. I gather we're similar. Like every morning for me, I have to be in the gym or in nature or both in order before pretty much anything else. It's the number one priority in my life, because if I don't take care of my body, then nothing else matters. Think about when you're sick. There's only one wish you have when you're sick. It's to not be sick. So I think the same thing is how to be proactive and take care of your body. Can you talk about some of the research and the science behind the get moving exercise?
Yeah. And this is one of those things, again, when I ask people to complete the sentence, I don't have time to. Exercise is frequently mentioned, and it is something that we neglect when we feel busy. But to your point, it is something not to neglect because it is so important. So research shows that exercising, it's a mood booster basically. Like, and
Mhm.
it's not only how you feel while you're doing it, that mood boosting, that energizing, carries over into how you engage in the rest of your day. So it is worth the time. So exercise, it increases our self-esteem, it makes us happier, it increases our cognitive functioning, and so that's a good thing. And so in the exercise, and the assignment. So when I actually give this assignment to my students, I tie a grade to it because I'm like, you guys need to make the time, need to make it a priority. And my intention is that once they are spending the time doing it, they will reflect on how impactful it was for their mood, their energy, and how they engage with the rest of their day. And the answer is always like, oh, yes, this is important. This is something I need to make time for. And I do it too. It is my morning run. It is something that is, I, in those times where I have neglected it because I have felt too busy, you see the negative effects on my mood as well as time affluence. So actually, our sense of how much time we have is perceptual. So it is this feeling of not having enough time to do all that you set out to do. But by doing things that actually increase your sense of self-efficacy, your feeling of being able to accomplish all that you set out to do, it actually makes you feel less time limited and more time affluent. And so uh, through exercise, you can actually uh, sort of give yourself, it starts you off not only on the right foot, but it has a really positive effect of propelling you into a day in a very confident and happy way.
So good. Let's focus on one more exercise. You briefly mentioned it earlier, and that is the random acts of kindness exercise. What's the science behind why this one is something we all should implement immediately?
Yeah. And it is doing nice things for other people. It not only makes them feel better, it makes us feel good too. And science shows that. And also, actually, as I was just mentioning, these ways of spending time that increase your sense of self efficacy and therefore your sense of being able to accomplish and all that you set out to do and your time affluence. Um, Spending time to help others is one way you can actually increase your sense of how much time you had. And I have a research paper that showed that sort of like giving time can give you time. Um, and doing acts of kindness, it can be little. So research shows that simply giving someone a compliment, like a stranger or someone you know, even though you think it will be awkward perhaps and not, like sure, it will make them happy, but research shows that it makes them significantly happier than you could ever think. And it's just as simple as, and it's also less awkward than you would think. And they are more surprised by it. Like we think like, oh, they know that they're shoes are cute or whatever. Like but giving them the compliment, it has these wonderful effects. So like acts of kindness, it can be as simple as giving a compliment. It can be about spending time to help another, which can, as I said, the research says it can give you time, and it also just makes you feel good and happy. So do
Uh,
it, be
yeah,
nice.
absolutely. I think it's a good thing for all of us through the instant you finish listening to this one to go just do something. It doesn't have to be big, something small. I had this weird question to you, Cassidy, that same one I asked James Clear about habits, and that is, do you feel a pressure to be really happy? Like when you're out with others, like do you feel this pressure to smile and to laugh and to appear or to be happy is because now you've written the book on a book called Happier Hour where they kind of expect you to be happy? What's that feel like?
Um, I'm good with it.
So you
I mean,
don't. You
there
don't
are
feel pressure.
I don't feel added pressure. I mean, again, it is a choice that I am making to
So happy, do you
prioritize.
think happiness for all people is a choice?
Yeah, so is touching back to what I was saying. We can make choices in how we spend our time, how we approach our time that have a significant influence on our happiness. Um, and of course, there are days where I feel more down. There are, like circumstances that hit me just like they do everyone. Um, and so it's not being oblivious to that. It's just my um, choosing. It's like, okay, here we go. This is how I will, get through this. And it's not to ignore the complexity of emotion um, that is so important. That's what like makes our life rich and full. But it is, I do choose the sort of positive end of that emotional spectrum and act accordingly. So it's not pressure in terms of from other people's eyes. It's more of a choice that I make.
What about like, I mean, there's a lot of talk about mental health, depression, things like that. How does what you do apply to people who may suffer from those things?
Yeah, it absolutely applies. And it's interesting because pre-pandemic, being a professor at a business school, I would have to make the case for why happiness is important. But unfortunately, these last couple of years have shown all of us, with depression rates increasing, anxiety rates increasing, all of us have experienced extreme negative emotion um, over these last few years, and so we don't take happiness for granted. And um, it is absolutely important to take care of our emotional well-being. And these exercises, these decisions are all um, in service of that, getting us through the tough times, and so that we can experience our days with more energy and with more brightness and more optimism.
You are a college professor, so I would imagine you have office hours or you have regular dialogue one on one with somebody who is in graduate school or maybe they're fresh out, so they're in their early 20s, let's say. What are some general pieces of life slash career advice you'd give to somebody in their early to mid 20s?
Yeah, I mean, my students are graduate students, they're MBAs, so they're in their sort of late 20s to early
Okay.
30s. But yes, my advice to them is to like, it's all about figuring out what is important to you and what are your values, what is your purpose, um, and to the extent possible finding a job that aligns with that. But in some cases it's not so clear and hitting you over the head of like, this is a purpose driven company and it happens to be like perfectly aligned with yours and it will help you pay your bills. Um, but to the extent that you know what's important to you and you select a job that satisfies sort of your basic needs, you can also be very, again, it's actually goes back to reflection. So one of the exercises, another exercise that in the book is to help you identify your purposes is 5 whys of why do you do what you do, and then asking, well, why is that important? And then as you ask yourself sort of 5 layers of why, it will really unpack what is it that really drives you, what is your sort of overarching goal. And through that identification, yes, it can help you sort of find a job that might be aligned with that, but it can also help you figure out how you dedicate your time within particular jobs, or even reframe activities within that job so that you understand the why of it, so that it doesn't feel so annoying and wasteful and like, like, yes, annoying or wasteful, that you're like, oh, this is in the service of like, I understand why I am doing this, why it's important. And it makes that task feel more fun. And then it also makes you overall more satisfied in the work that you're doing. Um, so I think that it is, to the extent that identifying for each individual, and it's also really important to do this identification because it helps. There's this sort of nebulous general sense of what is success. And if you have that, like, what is success that's influenced by other people, like what's driving them, that's not going to necessarily be intrinsically valuable for you. And then you're always going to be like measuring, how am I doing comparing to that person over there, which that social comparison is actually a great source of undermining one's happiness, because there's always going to be someone better on whatever dimension. And so you can, like, as you're picking of who you're going to compare yourself to, it can be a very sort of unhappy exercise. But once you've identified your own purpose, then that's actually your metric of success. You're like, how am I doing compared to what I say is my goal and important to me? And when you actually have little wins along the way, it's so satisfying because you're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it. And if you see yourself falling short, then that's actually fine. It's motivating. You're like, okay, this is where I'm getting to. But if you haven't clearly identified what it is that drives you, what is your purpose, then it's very easy to get lost. So that is the advice I give my students. And
Okay.
make sure you exercise in the morning and don't forfeit your relationships as you're trying to climb whatever ladder you've decided to climb.
Well, last question. Speaking of one of your relationships, in the acknowledgement section of your book, you said that your best friend is your brother Sam, and you thank him for keeping you laughing from your childhood through now. What is it? What is it about Sam that makes him your best friend?
Well, he is always there, and no matter the circumstances, again, to happiness being a choice. Some circumstances that we have been in haven't always been the happiest, but finding the way to make light of it. And he's funny. That's like, I am not funny, but I enjoy other people's humor, so I can laugh along. And so, yeah,
What's he
I'm
do?
happy you asked that. He's
Yeah.
great.
What does he do?
He does he works in the marketing area in event sponsorship, sort of basically planning parties and fun experiential events
Wow.
for brands.
Do you see each other much?
Well, he did the executive MBA program at Anderson at UCLA, and so that was really fun. He lives in New York,
He was in
which
your
is super
class
sad.
then?
He couldn't take my class. He did help TA for my class, but he was in the program. And so being in the program, being from New York, he would fly in for his weekends of classes. And so I got to see him a lot then.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, he's great.
Oh, I loved reading that. It was fun to see. The book is called Happier Hour: How to Beat Distraction, Expand Your Time, and Focus on What Matters Most. It was a joy to read. I like the structure too, Cassie, because you give kind of end of chapter highlights. You give all of the exercises, which we hit on a few of the exercises, but there's plenty of others for you to. I would encourage people to dive into the book because there's a lot of both great storytelling, great research that obviously, given your background, it's packed with that, but then practical application, actually exercises that you could implement right now that could make a difference. So you kind of hit all the checkpoints, I think, of what a book needs to be so that it could entertain you, inform you, as well as create action, so that it could better your life. So Happy Hour is the name of the book. Cassie, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to continue our dialogue as we both progress.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Thank you.